The sound of an 88mm shell striking the frontal armor of an M4 Sherman is described by survivors as a giant bell ringing inside a coffin. For the crew inside, that sound usually meant one of two things. Either the shell had ricocheted and you were the luckiest men in France, or it had penetrated. In June 1944, American armored crews landed in Normandy with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They had been told that the M4 Sherman was the greatest tank in the world. It was reliable. It was fast. It had a gyro-stabilized gun. The propaganda reels showed it crushing Axis resistance with ease. But propaganda does not stop armor-piercing capped ballistic shells. The reality of the European theater was a cold bucket of water. As the breakout from Normandy began, US tankers discovered a horrifying mathematical truth. The standard M4, with its 51mm of frontal armor aimed at a 56-degree slope, was adequate in 1942. But against the German Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun or the Tiger's 88mm, the Sherman was obsolete before it even fired a shot. The German guns could slice through a Sherman at ranges of up to 2,000 yards. Conversely, the Sherman's 75mm gun had to close within 500 yards, sometimes even closer to flank a Panther. This wasn't a fight, it was a hunt, and the Americans were the prey. A dark joke began to circulate among the crews of the 3rd and 7th Armored Divisions. They called their tanks Romsons after the cigarette lighter. The slogan was, "Lights first time every time." While the statistic of Shermans catching fire was actually comparable to other tanks of the war, the perception of vulnerability is what mattered. Fear is a powerful motivator. As the leaves fell in the autumn of 1944 and the Allied supply lines stretched thin towards the German border, the crews stopped waiting for up-armored tanks that headquarters promised. The M4A3E2 jumbo Sherman's heavy assault tanks with thick armor were rare beasts, maybe 1 in 100. For the average sergeant commanding a standard M4A3, looking at his 4 crewmates, the choice was simple. He could follow regulations, keep his tank light and fast, and pray a German gunner missed, or he could take matters into his own hands. This is where the story of the concrete Shermans begins. It is a story of desperation, engineering, improvisation, and a direct rebellion against the doctrine of the US Army. The first instinct of any soldier under fire is to dig a hole. If you can't dig a hole, you put the ground between you and the enemy. Naturally, the first modification was sandbags. By late 1944, it wasn't uncommon to see Shermans that looked more like moving fortifications than vehicles. Crews would weld heavy metal cages, often scavenged from farm fences or chicken wire, onto the hull and fill them with hundreds of sandbags. Psychologically, it felt safer. A foot of sand feels substantial. But ballistically, it was practically useless against a high-velocity anti-tank round. In fact, some ordnance tests suggested that sandbags might actually normalize the shell, tipping its nose into the armor rather than letting it deflect, making penetration easier. Worse, the sandbags were heavy. A fully sandbagged Sherman carried an extra 2 to 3 tons of dead weight, and when it rained, the sand absorbed water like a sponge. That 2 tons became 4 tons. The suspensions groaned. Transmissions overheated. The tanks became sluggish, wallowing pigs in the mud. Then there were the logs. Pine or oak logs bolted to the sides to detonate, Panzerfaust-shaped charges before they hit the hull. It was a valid theory against chemical energy weapons. But against a kinetic dart from a Tiger, the wood simply shattered, creating deadly splinters for any infantry walking alongside. The crews needed something harder, something that mimicked the rock-hard density of the steel itself. They looked at the destroyed bunkers of the Atlantic Wall. They looked at the foundations of the ruined French farmhouses. Concrete. It was cheap. It was available in every French village, and it could be molded. The process was surprisingly sophisticated. This wasn't just dumping wet cement on the hood. The crews would weld steel rods, often cut from destroyed enemy tank traps, or rebar from bombed buildings, directly onto the glacis plate of the Sherman. These rods acted as anchors. Then they built wooden forms, just like pouring a sidewalk. They would pour the concrete thick, sometimes up to 6 or 8 inches over the transmission housing and the front slope. Some crews got artistic. They angled the concrete to increase the effective thickness. They painted it olive drab to match the steel. From a distance you couldn't tell where the steel ended and the concrete began. In essence, these crews were creating a primitive form of composite armor. They were trying to create a surface that would shatter the incoming shell, or at least absorb enough energy so that the steel underneath could hold. But did it work, or were they just building a heavier coffin? That was the question that would be answered the first time they turned a corner and faced a German 88. While the crews were busy turning their tanks into concrete bunkers, a storm was brewing at headquarters. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, was not a fan of improvisation. He was a fan of discipline and speed. Patton's philosophy of armored warfare was built on mobility. Hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. You don't trade shots with a Tiger tank. You outmaneuver it. You flank it. You keep moving. To Patton, the concrete Shermans were an abomination. The extra weight destroyed the final drives. It blew out the bogie wheels. It strained the engines, causing breakdowns. A broken-down tank is a useless tank. But his objection wasn't just mechanical. It was psychological. Patton believed that adding sandbags and concrete made the crews timid. He argued that if a crew felt invulnerable, they would stop using cover. They would stop maneuvering. They would sit still and get killed. In early 1945, Patton issued a famous directive. He ordered that all unauthorized armor, sandbags, logs, and concrete be stripped immediately. He threatened to court-martial commanders who allowed their tanks to look like gypsy wagons. This order created a massive rift between the brass and the boys. Down in the mud, the sergeants didn't care about the final drive maintenance schedule. They cared about the fact that yesterday a Panzerfaust hit Jimmy's tank and the concrete stopped it. Interestingly, the enforcement of this order varied. In General Patch's 7th Army commanders turned a blind eye. They saw the concrete as a morale booster. If a few tons of cement kept the men fighting, so be it. But in Patton's 3rd Army, the crews had to be more creative, or more secretive. Some crews poured the concrete inside the transmission housing, which was incredibly dangerous for the gears. Others painted the concrete with metallic paint to fool inspections. It became a game of cat and mouse. The general wanted speed. The crews wanted survival. So who was right, the general or the sergeant? Let's look at the physics. Concrete is excellent at handling compression. That's why we build bridges with it. But under the point impact of a high-velocity shell, concrete is brittle. It doesn't stretch. It shatters. When a German armor-piercing round hits the concrete layer, several things happen in a millisecond. First, the concrete absorbs the initial shockwave. It shatters, and in doing so, it acts as a decapping agent. Armor-piercing shells often have a soft metal cap to help them bite into steel. The abrasive concrete could grind this cap away, or shatter the hard nose of the penetrator before it even touched the main armor. Against high-explosive anti-tank het rounds like the handheld Panzerfaust, the concrete was genuinely effective. Het rounds need to detonate at a precise distance from the armor to form a superplastic jet of copper. The concrete acted as standoff armor. It forced the warhead to detonate 6 inches too early. The deadly jet of molten metal would burn through the concrete, but lose its focus and energy before it could burn through the hull. There are documented reports of concrete Shermans taking hits from Panzerfausts and surviving with nothing more than a cracked facade and a shaken crew. In these specific cases, the gypsy wagon saved lives. However, there was a downside. When hit, the concrete would explode outward. It turned the front of the tank into a giant fragmentation grenade. Any infantry support walking in front of the tank would be shredded by flying rocks. And Patton was right about the maintenance. The added weight reduced the Sherman's top speed from 25 miles per hour to barely 15. It increased fuel consumption in a time when gas was liquid gold. A concrete Sherman was a safe bunker but a terrible vehicle. While many crews poured concrete and hoped for the best, the elite commanders knew that steel defeats steel. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion. A man so aggressive, General Patton himself called him the only tank commander he considered his equal. Abrams didn't use concrete. He used the carcasses of his enemies. His personal tank, Thunderbolt 7, was a Frankenstein monster of armored warfare. After every battle, Abrams's maintenance crews would take cutting torches to the destroyed German Panthers. They would cut out large squares of the Panther's high-quality, face-hardened frontal armor. They then welded these German plates directly onto the front of their Shermans and on the turret sides. But they did something genius. They often left a small air gap between the original hull and the new plate. This created spaced armor. If a German shell hit Thunderbolt 7, it had to punch through the stolen Panther plate first. This impact would shatter the shell's cap or cause it to tumble. By the time the projectile hit the actual Sherman armor underneath, it had lost most of its kinetic energy. While concrete was a poor man's armor, the Thunderbolt method was the professional's choice. It offered better protection per pound of weight. It didn't shatter, it didn't absorb water. This method was so effective that the Third Army authorized it for specific assault units, essentially bypassing Patton's hatred of sandbags. Patton respected results, and Abrams got results. Then came the 16th of December, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the coldest winter in Europe in decades. Temperatures dropped to zero, the mud turned into rock-hard ice. For the crews of the concrete Shermans, the weather was a new enemy. Concrete is porous. It absorbs moisture. When that moisture froze, it expanded. Crews woke up to find their improvised armor cracking and spalling off the hull before a shot was even fired. The vibration of the tank engine shook the frozen cement loose. Worse was the mobility kill. On the slippery, icy roads of the Ardennes, traction was everything. A standard Sherman weighed 30 tons. A concrete Sherman weighed 34 or 35 tons. That extra weight shifted the center of gravity forward. On ice, the concrete turtles became uncontrollable sleds. Drivers couldn't steer. They slid into ditches. They bogged down in deep snowdrifts where lighter tanks could have floated over. In the desperate defense of Bastogne, mobility was life. The inability to retreat or reposition quickly turned the concrete armor from a shield into an anchor. Many crews were forced to abandon their bogged-down fortresses and fight as infantry. It was a bitter lesson. In the pursuit of protection, they had sacrificed the Sherman's only true advantage, its agility. By February 1945, the Army finally responded to the pleas of the tankers. The M26 Pershing began to arrive. A true heavy tank, 90mm gun, thick armor, a match for the Tiger. But the psychological damage was done. The trust between the crew and the machine was broken. Even with the new Pershings, what did the crews do? They modified them. The most famous example is the Super Pershing. The crew didn't trust the factory armor. They scavenged boilerplates from a German factory and welded a massive crude shield onto the front. It looked medieval, like a knight wearing plate mail over his armor. This proved that the culture of improvisation, the concrete mindset, had become permanent. As the Allies pushed into Germany, the orders from Patton to strip the tanks were largely ignored or forgotten in the chaos of victory. The columns that crossed the Rhine were a motley crew of ragged, modified, concrete-covered beasts. They weren't pretty, they weren't regulation, but they had brought their crews to the finish line alive. Today, the U.S. Army operates the M1 Abrams. It uses Chobham composite armor layers of ceramic steel and depleted uranium designed to shatter projectiles. In a way, those terrified crews in 1944 were the first to invent composite armor. They didn't have ceramics or uranium. They had French cement and farmhouse rubble. But the principle was the same: disrupt the penetrator before it hits the vitals. The story of the concrete Shermans is not really about tanks. It is a story about the disconnect between the sterile theory of war planners and the messy reality of the battlefield. It is a testament to the American soldiers' refusal to accept the odds. When the government gave them a tin can and told them to fight a monster, they didn't run. They grabbed a shovel, they grabbed a welding torch, and they built a way to survive. General Patton wanted speed. The Ordnance Department wanted standardization. But the boys in the 3rd Armored Division, they just wanted to go home. And if 6 inches of concrete gave them a 1% better chance of seeing their mothers again, then it was worth every extra pound. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering of survival, hit that like button. It helps us dig up more forgotten stories. I'm Channel Name, thanks for watching.